අලුතෙන් SLT Mobitel Home 4G LTE connection ගන්න අයට වටිනා tab computers සහ data දීමනා. අලුතෙන් SLT Mobitel Home 4G LTE connection ගන්න අයට වටිනා tab computers සහ data දීමනා.
Best ever sunlight. දැන් රුපියල් 200ක best ever මිලකට.
In your headlines tonight, high hopes. The all-party conference gets off to a shaky start, despite presidential hopes for an apolitical solution.
This is a genuine effort to find short-term and as well as long-term solutions. This is not a political gimmick.
Into the gold. The visiting US Under-Secretary of State welcomes Sri Lanka's efforts to promote reconciliation and human rights. Where will it end? The Sri Lankan rupee edges up towards the 300 mark against the US dollar.
Sizable amount of dollars. I would imagine anything over 3 billion and 5 billion would be some kind of a reset for the exchange rate.
The gauntlet. The opposition leader is challenged in parliament to use his connections to end the fuel and gas shortages. All this and much more coming up tonight on First at 9, this Wednesday, the 23rd of March 2022.
මුළු රටටම සැඟවුණු අවුරුදු උකුරහස.
From AdaDerana, this is AdaDerana First at 9. Live from Studio 24 in Colombo.
And a warm welcome. Joining you tonight with news from across Sri Lanka and around the world, I'm Indivari Amuatha. It looks like there may be a new budget being presented soon, going by the outcome of the all-party conference that was held today, headed by President Gotabaya Rajapaksa and attended by the United National Party and Tamil National Alliance. According to reports, Finance Minister Basil Rajapaksa had agreed to a suggestion presented by UNP leader Ranil Wickremesinghe and former President Maithripala Sirisena that the need of the hour remains a new budget that will give the people additional relief.
The highly anticipated all-party conference between the parties aligned with the government and several opposition parties got underway today, chaired by President Gotabaya Rajapaksa and Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa, to discuss solutions and the way forward through the current economic crisis. Of the opposition parties, it was only the United National Party, represented by party leader Ranil Wickremesinghe, and the Tamil National Alliance attended the conference. The main opposition, the Samagi Janabalawegaya, and other opposition parties, the Jathika Janabalawegaya and the Tamil Makkal Thesiya Kuttani, party led by C.V. Vigneswaran, did not attend the conference. Nevertheless, today's conference commenced with President Gotabaya Rajapaksa delivering the opening remarks, where he called for genuine efforts to seek out a national solution.
This is a genuine effort to find short-term and as well as long-term solutions for the difficulties that we face today. This is not a political gimmick. Genuinely, I want to get the participation of all parties, all views, to find a lasting solution for various issues that we face today. And also I invite all the other parties who are not here to participate in this effort in future.
During the discussion, the governor of the central bank Ajit Niwat Cabral delivered an address where he cited the main reason for the foreign debt issue the island is facing as the high borrowings that took place between 2015 to 2019.
2015 සිට 2019 දක්වා අවුරුදු 5 තුල විදේශීය ණය ප්‍රමාණය ඇමරිකානු ඩොලර් බිලියන 23 සිට ඇමරිකානු ඩොලර් බිලියන 38.7 දක්වා 65%කින් වැඩි වුණා. ඊටත් වඩා භයානකව ජාත්‍යන්තර ස්වෛරී බැඳුම් කරවන වාණිජමය ණය ඇමරිකානු ඩොලර් බිලියන 5 සිට ඇමරිකානු ඩොලර් බිලියන 15 දක්වා 200%කින් වැඩි වුණා. එහෙත් රටේ ආර්ථිකයේ දලදේශීය නිෂ්පාදිතය වැඩි වූයේ ඇමරිකානු ඩොලර් බිලියන 79.4 සිට 84 දක්වා 5.8කින් පමණයි. යම් හේකින් එදා තිබූ ඇමරිකානු ඩොලර් බිලියන 79 දලදේශීය නිෂ්පාදිතය 2019 වෙන විට 65%කින් වැඩි වී තිබුණා නම් මෙම අභියෝගයේ දරුණු එකක් වන්නේ නැහැ.
This led to United National Party leader Ranil Wickremesinghe responding with a rebuke of the central bank governor for what he termed attempts to focus on the past and not on the future.
අපි මෙතෙන්ට ඇවිල්ලා තියෙන්නේ ඇත්ත වශයෙන්ම රටේ තියෙන මේ උග්‍ර ප්‍රශ්නේ. මෙතනදී අපි ආවේ නැහැ ආපහු මේ පක්ෂ දේශපාලනිත කවුද වග කියන්නේ කියලා මේව කරන්න. අර මම කනගාටු වෙන. එතුමා පටන් ගත්තේ මේක ගිය ආණ්ඩුවේ වැරද්දක් කියලා. මම ඒකට පිළිතුරු දුන්නා. තෝරන මොකද්ද ඊළඟට පිළිතුරු දෙනවද? ඒක ගියොත් මම පිළිතුරු. තව ඒතකොට මෙතුමා මේක අන්තිමට ඉවර වෙන්නේ විජය රාජ්‍යරුවනේ. එයා ලංකාවට ආවේ නැත්තම් මේ ප්‍රශ්නේ තියෙන්නේ නැහැ කියලා. ඕකයි වෙන්නේ. ඉතින් මොනකටද අපි හිතෙන්ට යන්නේ?
Now, Sri Lanka's economy has been under siege, we could say, for the past 3 years, having faced what we could term a series of unfortunate incidents since the 2019 Easter Sunday attacks that dealt the country's main foreign exchange earner, the tourism industry, a serious blow. Events since then have not helped in the country's efforts to recover. Faced with a serious dearth of foreign exchange now and recent shortages in key commodities, questions remain as to the government's effectiveness in handling this crisis. With the government having recently floated the rupee and hints of possible International Monetary Fund assistance in the offing, it begs the question whether this will be sufficient. With that, we have with us Professor of Practice of International Development at Georgetown University, a former Chief Economist of the World Bank for South Asia region, Professor Shanta Devarajan, to help us figure out what our options are. A very warm welcome, good evening and good morning to you there.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be here.
All right. Professor Devarajan, I think before we move on to discuss about what Sri Lanka is faced, now I'd like to understand what this really means for us, the IMF program. We talk about rollout, debt restructuring, we talk about an IMF program, but I don't think we here in Sri Lanka do really understand what it means to go into the IMF or to defer or have a bailout. What does it really mean? And for Sri Lanka, what's the best option now?
Okay, the starting point is that Sri Lanka has a very serious problem. In fact, it has two problems. One is the country has a liquidity problem. It doesn't have very much foreign exchange reserves. They're about $800 million of foreign exchange reserves, whereas imports are costing more and more. But the second, which is even more serious, is that Sri Lanka has an insolvency problem, that the debt is not sustainable. So that all of the analysis shows that the country at the current rate will not be able to pay back the debt over time. And that's why people are calling for a debt restructuring. And I want to be very clear that a debt restructuring is different from a debt default. And a debt restructuring involves beginning to negotiate with the creditors, all of the official and the private creditors, to reduce the level of debt to a point where Sri Lanka can actually pay it back. A default, by contrast, is one where the country just reaches a point where they can't pay anything. And that could be disastrous for the country. I mean, countries like Lebanon that actually experienced a default had their GDP fall by 20% and inflation reach over 100%. So we want to avoid that. But you also want to undertake a debt restructuring because the alternative, which is hoping that you can pay back the debt as it's currently required, will cause an undue hardship to the people. And we're seeing it on the streets right now. There's a shortage of fuels and pharmaceuticals and food, and prices are skyrocketing. This is, you should not be paying back the creditors and starving the people at this point. So I think the debt restructuring is the orderly process by which you negotiate with the creditors. Now, where the IMF comes in is that in order to undertake this negotiation with the creditors, first, Sri Lanka has to appoint a financial advisor. But most importantly, the IMF can do the analysis to see what is the debt that is sustainable for the country. And it's important to have an agency like the IMF do that analysis because they're credible. They're actually, their analysis is objective. So the IMF will do that analysis and present that to the creditors, and then they can help coordinate that negotiation with the creditors to see how much each person's debt can be reduced or postponed. It doesn't necessarily have to be reduced. It just gets postponed or rescheduled in such a way that Sri Lanka can come out of this very difficult situation on a more sustainable path.
Professor,
now, the second part of
yes, go on.
The second part of that is that in order to achieve that sustainable, a more sustainable debt, Sri Lanka has to undertake certain fiscal adjustments. Because right now, the revenue, it's collecting so little revenue from taxes that's one of the reasons why they can't pay back the debt. So they may have to raise tax revenues and also cut some subsidies and cut some other expenditures on the public budget that are draining the treasury. Now, those are steps that need to be taken in order to achieve a sustainable debt. The difference is with an IMF program, you undertake those steps. It also then opens up new sources of financing for the country from the IMF, but also from the World Bank. That'll open up the possibility that the World Bank can provide
now,
budget
Professor,
support to the country.
In your view, are we on track? Now, we understand the government was telling us that we're going for a homegrown solution. But as the crisis developed, we're now opening up. There are hints that we will work with the IMF. There's also the government showing us that they're ready to move into other restructuring plans for the economy. There's the all-party conference meeting up, and there's also an economic council with an advisory committee appointed to it. But again, floating the rupee to reaching out to the IMF. Are we on track? Are we on track to ensure that those policies that you were talking about will be achieved?
Well, those two things that you mentioned, floating the rupee and raising interest rates, by the way, are also part of that restructuring program. But the two things that are missing, but I think the government has at least started discussing at least one of them, which is this appointment of a financial advisor. That's very important, and all countries that have undertaken debt restructuring have started with that. And one point about the reason why there's an urgency is that just by appointing a financial advisor, that financial advisor can then negotiate a postponement of the interest payments on the debt that's coming due in the next 3 months, which could be an enormous relief when you have all these import bills to be paid. That instead of having to pay interest payments to the creditors, you can use it to buy necessary imports for the population. But the second is some signal that the country is going to undertake the fiscal reform, whether it's simply a question of raising the threshold on who has to pay VAT or who has to pay income tax, lowering the threshold, of who has to pay VAT or who has to pay income tax, can be an important step in that direction. And that's the kind of thing that gives confidence, not just to the IMF, but also to the creditors, that the country is serious about restructuring its debt.
Very quickly, Professor, from international investors to local exporters, as well as the general public, how do we set the kind of confidence? And again, in your expertise, is this a situation that we can come out of in the short term? And again, immediately, in the next few days, what must the government do?
Absolutely. I think it can be done, and it has been done. There are many countries that have undertaken debt restructuring. And just give you, Jamaica or Ecuador have done it recently. And the important thing is that having undertaken a debt restructuring with an IMF program, most of these countries were able to resume borrowing in capital markets in 6 to 9 months. So I would say that's a horizon that Sri Lanka can look towards if they start now. And they have started, as you said, with certain of the steps. But the two most important steps, I think, that need to be taken in the next 3 weeks is the appointment of a financial advisor and a change in the thresholds in some of the tax rates, the tax payments, the thresholds of eligibility, so that there will be an increase in fiscal revenues. With those two signals, I think when the finance minister, I think, is supposed to visit the IMF here in Washington in April, there's a good chance that then they can reach an agreement to start working on an IMF program and start pursuing this debt restructuring. And that would give tremendous relief to the current situation in the country. Then you might be able to afford many more imports, and it'll relax some of these constraints and relieve some of the shortages that are going through in the country.
Thank you very much, Professor Devarajan. Indeed, it was a very fruitful and informative discussion. I look forward to talking to you at length. We had with us Professor of the Practice of International Development at Georgetown University, Professor Shanta Devarajan, who is also a Chief Economist for South Asia of the World Bank. We'll see you right after this short break.
Big 3.
Opposition leader Sajith Premadasa was issued a challenge by Chief Government Whip Johnston Fernando in Parliament today to use his international connections to provide fuel and LP gas in order to alleviate the public's suffering. The challenge was issued after the opposition leader urged the government to reject recent Indian government material grants and instead ask for donations of fuel and gas.
දැන් යෝජනාවක් ඇවිල්ලා තියෙනවා කැබිනට් අනුමැතියට අනුමතත් කරලා තියෙනවා ඩෝනියර් නිරීක්ෂණ යානා දෙකක් ප්‍රදානය කිරීම පිරික්සුම් සහ බේරා ගැනීම සඳහා අනන්‍ය ආර්ථික කලාපේ නිරීක්ෂණය කරන්න. ඒ වගේම ටොන් 4000ක පාවෙන තටාංගයක් ඒකත් ප්‍රදානය. සමුද්‍රීය මුදවා ගැනීම සම්බන්ධීකරණ මධ්‍යස්ථානයට සහාය දීම සඳහා ස්ථානයක් නිර්මාණය කිරීම. ඒ වගේම ඩිජිටල් රාමුවක් සඳහා මූල්‍ය පහසුකම් ලබා ගැනීම. මෙන්න මේ වගේ විවිධ විදේශීය ගනුදෙනු සිදු වෙනවා. සමහරක් ඒවා ප්‍රධාන, සමහරක් ඒවා රාජ්‍ය අරමුදල් සහ විදේශීය අරමුදල් එක්ක ඒකාබද්ධව ක්‍රියාත්මක වෙන වැඩසටහන. මම කරුණු දෙකක් කියන්න කැමති නියෝජ්‍ය කතානායකතුමනි. අද රටේ අවශ්‍යතාවය මොකද්ද? රටේ මිනිසුන්ගේ ඉල්ලුම මොකද්ද? මිනිස්සු ඉල්ලනවා තෙල් ටික. භූමි තෙල් ටික, ඩීසල් ටික, පෙට්‍රල් ටික. පෝලිං වල ඉන්නේ නැතුව. මිනිස්සු ඉල්ලනවා ගෑස් ටික. පෝලිං වල ඉන්නේ නැතුව. මිනිස්සු ඉල්ලනවා කිරිපිටි ටික. මිනිස්සු ඉල්ලනවා බඩු මිල අඩු කරන්න. මිනිස්සු ඉල්ලනවා පෝර ටික වගා කරන්න. ඇයි අපිට ඉල්ලන්න බැරි ඩෝනියර් පරීක්ෂණ යානාව ප්‍රදානයක් නැතුව ඇයි අපිට තෙල් ටික ප්‍රදානය කරන්නයි කියන්න බැරි? ඇයි අපි මේ පාවෙන තටාංගයක් ප්‍රදානය කරන්න යනකොට ඇයි අපිට ඉල්ලන්න බැරි ගෑස් ප්‍රශ්නයට ප්‍රදානයක්?
ඒතර ඔබතුමා මම දැක්කා ඔබතුමාගේ අර උද්ඝෝෂණය කියනවා රටවල් 3කින් ගෑසුයි තෙලුයි දෙන්න. ඉතින් ඔබතුමා අද ස්වර්ණ පාරිශ්‍රය සමුළුවට ගිහිල්ලා ওই රටවල් තුනේ ඔබතුමා තෙල් ගෙනල්ලා දුන්නොත් ඔබතුමාට ලොකු ජයග්‍රහණයක් නේද? මිනිස්සු කොච්චර ඔබතුමාට ගරු කරයිද? ඔබතුමාට කියයි රටට ආදරය කරන ජනතාවට ආදරය කරන විපක්ෂ නායකයෝ දේශපාලන ભેදකින් තොරව තමන්ගේ රටේ ජනතාව ආරක්ෂා කරන්න බොහොම කැපවීමෙන් ඒ ගෞරවය ඔබතුමා ගන්න. ඉතින් ඔබතුමාට ඒ රටවල් තුන තියෙනවා නම් ඉක්මනින් මේ ඒ ටික උදව් කරන්න ගිහිල්ලා මේ ඔබතුමාගේ ශක්තියක් තියෙනවා නම් එහෙම රටවල් තුන ඔබතුමා කවදා බලයට එයිද දන්නේ නැහනේ. ඉතින් ඔබතුමාට බලය නැති කාලේ හරි මේ රටේ මිනිස්සුන්ට මෙහෙම වැඩක් කරන්න පුළුවන් නම් ඊටමත් හොඳ දෙයක්. ඉතින් ඔබතුමාගේ ඊටමත් ගෞරවයෙන් ඉල්ලනවා උදව් කරන්න. ඒක හොඳයි ඔබතුමාටත් හොඳයි. එහෙම තියෙනවා නම් ගෙනල්ලා දෙන්න. તો මිනිස්සු කියයි ප්‍රේමදාස මහත්තයා දක්ෂයෙක්. එතුමා දේශපාලන වේදිකින් තොරව මේ රටවල් වලට ගිහිල්ලා අපිට තෙල් ප්‍රශ්න විසඳුවා. ගෝඨාභය ජනාධිපතිතුමාට බැරි වුණා. ගෑස් ප්‍රශ්න විසඳුවා. ගෝඨාභය ජනාධිපතිතුමාට බැරි වුණා. ඉතින් ඒ ගෞරවය ගන්නකො ඔබතුමා. අපිට විරුද්ධ නැහැ.
ඒ රටවල් ලෑස්ති නැහැ මේ ජාතිවාදයේ වපුරලා මේ රට විනාශ කරපු ආණ්ඩුත් එක්ක ගනුදෙනු කරන්න ඒගොල්ලෝ ලෑස්ති නැහැ.
හොඳයි.
ඒගොල්ලෝ ලෑස්ති අපිත් එක්ක ගනුදෙනු කරන්න.
හොඳයි බොහොම ස්තුතියි ඔබතුමාට.
වැඩ බැරි නම්
ඔබතුමා ගෞරවය ගන්නකො. ඔබතුමා කවදා බලයට එයිද කියලා දන්නේ නැහනේ. එහෙම වුණත් කඩාකල් මේ ප්‍රශ්න දින වෙලාවේදී අපි අදක්ෂද දක්ෂද කියන එක තීන්දුව කරන්නේ මැතිවරණයකදී. අපි මැතිවරණේ තිබ්බහම බලමු කවුද අදක්ෂද දක්ෂද කියලා ජනතාව තීන්දුව කෙරුවනේ දැන් මැතිවරණ දෙකකදී. ඒ නිසා අපි කියන්නේ තමුන්නාන්සේට අභියෝග කරනවා. පුළුවන් නම් අපේ අදක්ෂකම් ඔක්කොම අපි තීන්දුව කරමු පස්සේ ජනතාවට දෙන්න. පුළුවන් නම් ගේන්න කියලා
වැඩ කටයුතු ආරම්භ කරන අමාත්‍ය
During the fourth Sri Lanka-US partnership dialogue that took place earlier today, visiting Under-Secretary for Political Affairs of the US State Department, Victoria Nuland, endorsed Sri Lanka's initiative to seek assistance from the International Monetary Fund, terming it a vital move. Under-Secretary Nuland also commended the efforts taken by the government towards justice and reconciliation.
The fourth Sri Lanka-US partnership dialogue was convened with the participation of the Under-Secretary for Political Affairs of the US State Department, Victoria Nuland, and Foreign Minister Professor G.L. Peiris in Colombo today. The discussions focused on renewing mutually shared commitment to economic prosperity, sustainable development, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. Both delegations reaffirmed their commitment to the bilateral relationship firmly rooted in shared values as fellow democracies, and they are intent to work together to further strengthen the partnership.
I want to particularly commend the Foreign Minister and his partnership with the Justice Minister in moving forward on all of these issues of national healing and justice. As you take those steps, it will open even more space for our partnership, particularly in the security arena, which is already strong. Our economic relationship is absolutely vital. It is already strong throughout the COVID period. Our trade actually grew, which is quite stunning. What's absolutely crucial, though, is the courageous step by the government to reach out to the International Monetary Fund for help now with your debt overhang, with your fiscal and monetary needs. And as you roll up your sleeves and do the hard work to strengthen and heal the economy here, the United States will be your partner, and we will strengthen the capacity in our embassy to work with you at this vital moment.
Sri Lanka and the United States share certain core values with regard to the law governing the oceans. We believe in a rules-based order, in the sanctity of navigation through international waters. We also talked about reconciliation in the aftermath of a ferocious 30-year conflict which came to an end only in May 2009. I briefed His Excellency about the initiatives that we have put in place to deliver on these issues, local mechanisms, the amendment of the Prevention of Terrorism Act yesterday in Parliament, the Commission of Inquiry headed by Justice Nawaz, which was appointed by the President and which has now handed in a very insightful and imaginative report.
Now, with the Sri Lankan rupee having depreciated by almost 40% in the past 2 weeks and now being offered at almost 300 rupees at some private banks, fears are now high that the sky is the limit for the currency. Economist Dr. Indrajit Aponso believes that the only measure that will lead to some stability is an emergency injection of between 3 to 5 billion US dollars into the market, which may go some way towards arresting the activities of the currency speculators.
On the 8th of March, the Sri Lankan rupee, which was constantly capped at a value of 202 rupees and 99 cents against the US dollar, was floated by the central bank. According to the central bank website, the US dollar buying rate as of today is 274 rupees and 99 cents, while the selling rate is 284 rupees and 99 cents. At state-owned People's Bank, the buying rate is 277 rupees and 99 cents, while the selling rate stood at 289 rupees and 99 cents. Further, the buying rate offered by the Bank of Ceylon is 275 rupees and its selling rate is 285 rupees. However, at private banks, the US dollar exchange rate looks to be at a much higher level, with the buying rate currently between the range of 273 rupees and 50 cents and 280 rupees. The selling rate now ranges between 285 rupees and 300 rupees, with one specific private quoting 300 rupee level. Going by these figures, it shows that the rupee has depreciated by 40% and 47% in just past 2 weeks. Economist Dr. Indrajit Aponso says that in order to stem this situation, a significant amount of US dollars will need to be injected into the market.
If we say 300, which is basically from 200 to 300 is almost about 50% increase. That is quite unsustainable for a country like ours, for any country for that matter. As a measure to counter the countries getting about 1 billion from China and 1 billion from India. But the problem is it may not be sufficient to settle the market. So from a policy perspective, I would imagine that you need to have a sizable amount of cash being put into the market and to put to the reserve, so that the speculators who are driving this exchange rate gap between the expected exchange rate and the real market exchange rate can be arrested only through that kind of a major assault onto the market system with a sizable amount of dollars. I would imagine anything over 3 billion and 5 billion would be some kind of a reset for the exchange rate.
The Court of Appeal has issued an order directing the Commissioner General of Lands to ignore a circular issued directing his department to transfer the administration of non-protected forests to divisional secretaries. The Court of Appeal bench, comprising Justices Sobitha Rajakaruna and Dhammika Ganepala, issued the directive after taking a writ petition filed by the Centre for Environmental Justice that sought to challenge the circular. Now, the petitioners alleged that the circular issued took steps to transfer the administration of non-protected forests known as other state forests to regional authorities with a view to releasing them for agriculture and development. They pointed out that due to this, the forests have been cleared and prepared for cultivation, leading to a risk of deforestation and serious environmental complications. Hence, the Court of Appeal issued an order directing the Land Commissioner General not to follow the circular. The order is effective until the 1st of September, while the court has also issued notices to the 5 respondents, including the Lands Commissioner General and the Director General of Forest Conservation. We'll see you again tomorrow at the same time with your daily dose of news. Good night.